get started with my points that I want to make today, I was curious a little bit about what brought you guys to this session today. So if anybody has, like a specific reason why this topic was interesting to them. Is it because your organization is asking you to innovate? Is it because, you're just curious about the topic? So chime in or I will call on you. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that's been really important to me all through my career is how do you create good teams that can produce, and I'm always willing to learn more about the subject.
Yeah, great. In the back, yeah.
I would like to know why the letter T. What is the T?
Okay, so my marketing ploy worked on you, where I put together a fun name or a title for the talk just to draw you guys in. So I'll explain that a little bit. To those of you who came a little bit later, we're going to go off of these as my slides, so there's no PowerPoint. And we're just mainly going to have a conversation about innovation and the environments in which innovation happens, and a little bit about the definition of innovation. So I wanted to first start by telling you guys a story. And this is a story about my son from last year. So last year he was in the 2nd grade, and he had a science project where he had to go and figure out a topic that he wanted to do a science project and then write a report on. And so as part of this project, he figured out, he did some search on some experiments, and he found an experiment that he wanted to run and started writing his report. So I found him on his computer starting to write down the instructions for how to perform the experiment. So what are the steps? And that was fine. Okay, Noah, what are you doing? Just writing down the instructions. All right, you write those down and then figure out what your next steps are going to be and what you need next. And then I'll come back and help you get set up for your experiment. So one of the things that he did then was, I left for a little while and I came back, and then he's writing down the experiment and the experiment results. So he's copying the experiment results off of the web page. And I'm like, no, what are you doing? I'm writing down the results. But you didn't run the experiment. But why would I run the experiment if it already tells me what the results are going to be? Right? So I said, basic parenting 101 skills because I said so. So don't do that. That's not good parenting. But I tried to explain that this is a learning process, and even though we already know the results, yes, we're going to try and run the experiment so that we learn something from it. So we went ahead and did the experiment, but he made a very good point, which was when you don't have any variables that you're really not sure of how they're going to impact your results, it's not really an experiment. Right? You're not really innovating or coming up with something new. You're basically copying what's already been done, and you're coming up with a known end result. So when we try to innovate by following someone else's formula, that's not really going to be innovation. And one of this book that I brought with me, The Myths of Innovation, was a really good read because it helped me understand a little bit about some myths around how we think about innovation. And dispels some of those myths and helps create a framework for thinking about innovation. And so again, one of the myths that he talks about is that there really is no formula for innovation. So I can't give you a process and tell you do this thing and then do this thing and then this thing, and then you will find innovation in your organization. But what we can look at is what are the environments that allow innovation to happen, right? And what types of things, I like to think about it in terms of what types of things do we not want to do so that we don't hinder innovation. And so we'll talk about those in a little bit. But first I wanted to start by defining kind of what is innovation. And in terms of everything that I've been reading, innovation is to make something new. So you must have at least one unknown variable. So the example that he gives in the book was funny. If nobody else has ever tried to deep fry Twinkies in space, that's an actual experiment because you don't know what the results are, right? But if you're following a known process, then it's not going to be a true experiment. So, however, the one thing that we also need to acknowledge is that real innovation comes at a price. And that's where we get stuck. So So we want to have innovation, but we also want to govern it with our existing bureaucratic, whatever, organizational policies and procedures, without allowing for that there to be variability or some shift in how we manage those teams. And that's a problem, because we have to recognize that in order for people to be able to innovate, we have to acknowledge that there's either going to be risk in terms of money or time or sanity or something, but there's something that we're risking in order to try and allow for real innovation. And failure is one of the things that can happen when we try and experiment. So understanding the price, but then setting boundaries for what level of risk we are okay with is a really important thing within organizations. So I'm not saying, let your teams go wild and just experiment at will. I'm saying there has to be a price, but we can also be smart about understanding what level of risk we're okay with accepting by setting our boundaries. So I'm okay if we spend up to this amount of budget experimenting in this field for this certain objective. So that goes back to how we then define for our teams what they're innovating or what they're thinking about. So we tend to sometimes try to get too granular when we ask teams to, I want you to innovate this specific thing, when really it should be more around outcomes, right? So defining a really good innovation comes from an interestingly framed problem. When we think about problems in an interesting way that's more about what are the benefits, what are the outcomes that I want to create for whoever is going to consume this innovation, then we can start thinking backwards and engineering the innovation process. We tend to jump into solution mode before we start really digging into the problems. So digging into the problem we're trying to solve, or the challenge that we're trying to solve for, is the first step. So one of the things too is that how much risk are you willing to take on? And that's where some companies have defined a specific budget for innovation, and that also kind of defeats the purpose, because then it almost becomes a job. So this is the reason why I asked, do any of your companies have an innovation department? I know of companies that have created a very specific lab structure within their companies for innovation, and if you're a part of that lab, then you're defined as your job is innovation. And so that removes the idea of coming up with new ideas or even contributing new ideas from the rest of the organization. And I feel like that is actually destructive, because if you want to have a culture of innovation, it should be we need to acknowledge that ideas come from everywhere, not only the select few that we put into this lab environment. Yeah?
Call it a need to change how you work rather than how others work. Lab says I change how others work.
Yeah.
And really the innovation is how I approach my job.
Absolutely. So if you approach innovation is something that happens when I allow interesting ideas to have an opportunity to collide for people with different backgrounds, then I'm creating an environment where everyone feels like they can contribute an idea. And I'll talk a little more specifically about that in a little bit.
Yeah. I frequently found that some of the best innovations come from people who are brand new to a situation.
Yes.
Because they're not used to seeing it the same way.
Right. Because they haven't been ingrained in the culture of that organization, and what's okay to think about, what's not okay to think about, what's okay to suggest, what's not okay to suggest. And that's where, sometimes with somebody who's external to the organization coming in and kind of helping that kindling of those ideas and that thought process has been a really fun exercise that I've been able to do with some companies, where we just go in and we start the brainstorming process, or we start thinking about, hey, what are some ways that we can allow your people, your employees, to contribute their ideas that they normally wouldn't contribute. So anyway, again, one of the main points that I've been finding has been really interesting is that innovation tends to happen. What do you think when you think about the word innovation? What do you think in terms of company structure or team structure? For me, I immediately start thinking about startups, right? So I think about kids tinkering in a garage, or innovative, on the edge type of technology and on the edge type of activities. And so these days, before the internet, things were really rigid. We had a business plan, we had a budget for something, somebody had a specific idea, and we built that idea. And now the access to ideas, the access to collaboration, and the access to other people, the cost of that has gotten so low that innovation is getting pushed outside the boundaries of the centralized, like, big organizations, and it's going into the smaller teams of people who are doing it just because it's fun, or people who are doing it in their dorm rooms. And so that's a really interesting phenomenon to understand and to explore, because we know that our company isn't going to have the same environment as a dorm room, but what can we take from that and bring it into our environments? So, as we've seen, designer and engineer-based innovation has been really what's been creating this whole movement of startups, and it's been a lot faster than what we had when we had MBA-driven innovation. So there's a great TED Talk actually by a man named Joy Ito. He's from the MIT Media Lab, J-O-I, and his last name is I-T-O. It's a really inspiring talk about how innovation has kind of become democratized. And by understanding the democratic nature of that, we can understand that command and control type environments within our companies are not going to foster the innovation that we're seeking from our people. So that's where I wanted to talk a little bit about this whole T-shaped idea, right? So what kind of environments lead to innovation and good ideas? I want to read you guys something from this book. Is another really good read, Lean Enterprise, because I think that we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves to innovate when sometimes we just really need to redefine what we mean by innovation. Maybe it just means pursuing an idea that was really good, or making something that we have already made better than it already is. Not necessarily like creating a new technology or creating a new way of doing things. It might just be doing something better, or serving a customer's needs better. Somebody here mentioned that they work with the customer service aspect of things, and even redefining how we approach customer service can be considered an innovation. So anyway, so let's see this page. I wanted to read this. So it says, why you cannot simply hire or acquire your way to innovation. A number of enterprises have been acquiring startups in an attempt to pick on a current trend and accelerate innovation, perhaps to diversify and balance their portfolio, to turn themselves into innovation labs, or to tick a box. We have seen at close hand the poor outcomes this creates, with these acquisitions failing to produce the expected return and the senior staff leaving as soon as they could to exercise their options. The problems occur when the acquired company, who is working on more of a cutting edge type of product, is subjected to the acquired company's governance, right? So when the acquired company, which is typically a startup, they're more innovative or more on the edge of technology, then come into the larger company and they're subjected to the governance rules of the larger company. So the financial targets and the management structures of the acquiring enterprise completely destroying its ability to innovate. Sometimes people from the parent organization are rotated through the innovation lab in the hope that this will magically teach them how to innovate in a different horizon, instead of simply giving them culture shock. Acqui-hiring frequently fails for the same reason. Taking great people and putting them into a pathological or bureaucratic culture does not change the culture, it breaks the people. The solution is to do the hard work to transform the culture of your own organization and grow effective leadership and management appropriate to each horizon, which will incidentally remove the need to hire in or acquire innovators. So I found that to be a really interesting perspective, because I've seen this happen with companies where they think that if we bring in a group of people that are defined as innovators in their own space, or they've done things in their space, and we bring them in, now they can innovate for us too. But when you bring them in and subject them to the same types of management structures or the same types of ways that you run your company, that's not going to work for them. So one thing for us to start thinking about the culture in our organizations is, again, to acknowledge that good ideas aren't isolated events. So even though we hear these stories of these eureka moments, right, and somebody just coming up with an idea, that's rarely how that actually tends to happen, right? Those eureka moments are a compilation of a number of years of work and leading up to that moment, and also they come from that person having those collisions with other people that have influenced the way that they think, or they've read things that have influenced the way that they think, or they've worked together and partnered with people that have also helped them with certain things, and so then they come up to that kind of what we hear about in the fables and the stories of the eureka moment. So actually, ideas are a network that are the product of the coming together of ideas from other people. So this is where I start to think about, you want to create an environment where you have people who have depth as well as breadth of experience, right? So the idea of cross-functional teams is something that, if you've been in the agile development world, you've heard about it a lot. But it's something that, as we think, in a larger context about innovation, that concept really applies, because when you have people working together that have an opportunity to come together and bring ideas from their different backgrounds, that's where you get the more well-rounded, more innovative ideas. So, for example, I've worked with companies where the departments are very strongly segmented. So the marketing department sits in a very separate area. They never see, for example, the design department. The design department sits in a very separate area. They never see the developers, or QA is isolated in this area, or sales. Even smaller teams within those departments have sometimes been segmented or isolated. And so one of the things that I do with companies sometimes is to break those silos. So to say, if we're working on a project together, and I'm going to need you, and I'm going to need you, and I'm going to need you, instead of just bringing you to a weekly meeting once a week, why don't we all now just sit in the same area? I understand that you might have other things that you're working on, other days of the week or during other times in your week, but when it comes to having those conversations, let's all sit together and have one area where we're working. And having those cross-functional teams that can pull from different experiences, all sitting together, has been really powerful. So they can bring together those ideas. Another thing that we also need to understand is, we try to govern and make people's time very, isolated into, you have this many hours of meetings, and then you have to go and work at your computer. And I know that it sounds cliche to bring this up as an example, but there are companies like Google, like other companies that allow people a certain percentage of their time to work on ideas that they care about. And it sounds like a gimmick or a fad, but it actually really works, right? Even when they were small, even when they didn't have a lot of money, when they did this with people, that's when people felt like they had the safety, right? Because if you tell people, yeah, come up with ideas when you're bumping into each other in the halls, that's not going to feel really safe unless you give them a structure for doing that. So by giving them structure for unstructured activities, right, you're providing them with that environment where they feel safe in coming up with those ideas, or discussing them, or trying something, or experimenting. So saying something like, you have 10% of your time every week, you can work on things with people that you care about. Not people you care about, ideas that you care about with other people. Hopefully you care about the people too. But so setting those boundaries, but giving people that structure helps them really think in terms of, okay, I have this amount of time that's available to me, so I don't have to feel bad about missing a meeting, or about not being at this other activity, or about doing my development job, or whatever it is, role that I have in the organization. Another thing that, if you guys get a chance to look this up, there was a study by a researcher named Kevin Dunbar that basically he found that breakthrough ideas happen in chaotic spaces where people with different backgrounds are allowed to collide. So having the very sterile work environments that we have now sometimes with the cubes and everybody's separated from everybody else, and it's very sterile, is not really where you're going to get the breakthrough or the new ideas, right? So if you go into these companies that have more of these open environments and places where people are bumping into each other and talking, and you see people, those are the places, or those are the environments that you need to replicate if you're looking for innovation. So, all right, so I've talked a lot about kind of the theory behind some of this stuff. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit more of like, Okay, let's think about this a little bit more in terms of a framework. So I would say step one, we want to create work environments that combine cross-functional skill sets in spaces where ideas can collide. You can easily start doing that in your own organizations simply by going and saying, okay, if we have a project that there are a number of people that are working on, instead of having the guy from front-end development and back-end development and design and whatever, all of them are sitting in separate areas, for at least for the duration of this project, have them come together, right? Even if it's not under the idea of this is an innovation team, right? Start creating that culture of cross-functional teams, where people who are working on projects together are, living, eating, breathing, sitting together. Step two, give people time to experiment with new ideas, but we want to create, again, that structure with unstructured time. So give structure for that time, but at the same time make sure we're not stifling. So we're not saying like, I'm going to give you this 10% of your time where you can do stuff, but it has to be spent doing this, this, and this, right? So give structure for unstructured activities. Also, actually, it turns out, have you guys seen or heard of the book Drive? The Surprising Truth? Yeah, of course. So, people are really motivated by feeling like they're working on something meaningful. So the smart companies are the companies that are rewarding people with time, not necessarily with material things. So I always get frustrated when I see companies that are like, yeah, if you've made it X number of hours for the last 2 months, then you're gonna get free movie tickets, right? Those are like little short-term bursts, but if you reward people with time to actually do things that they feel are meaningful, that's gonna be a lot more motivating for people to do their best for you. So then step number 3, encourage new ideas from everyone versus forcing or isolating innovation to an innovation department led by an innovation officer. Right, so this culture of innovation versus isolated, you are the innovators, is really what's going to help you get the best ideas.
Yep.
And then step 4, encourage, teach, and foster some of these things like agility, right? The concepts and the principles behind agility aren't only for software development, right? The ideas of cross-functional, the ideas of short deliverables, right? Having really small pieces of work that you then deliver and you inspect and you figure out what was working well, what wasn't working out well, and what do we need to improve for the next go-round. Versus trying to do big bang releases of things, right? So have this bias towards taking action and towards getting something out and releasing versus trying to perfect things over a long period of time. Challenging the status quo. So being okay with and actually encouraging people to ask questions and to challenge the way that things have been run, to challenge the way that they've been doing things for the last however long, like you said about your team. Maybe it means bringing in somebody who is willing to challenge the status quo and can help foster that with the rest of the team. And also not allowing people in management positions to stifle that questioning. Because that's where things start to get tough for people, is when my manager isn't really allowing me and that means my job is at threat and I'm not safe, then I'm gonna stop. So also when it comes to agility, having more of a compass versus a plan, right? Because through Agile, we've learned that planning every single detail of a project or a product development is really, for the most part, useless, because you're going to learn as you start to implement and as you start to get into the guts of something, things that you didn't know in the front end. So minimize the time and the effort that you're spending in those front end planning and detailed planning activities and allow that time instead to be spent learning. So we want to create a culture of learning organizations that learn by doing. And so the last step was to create trust. So people need to feel protected and they need to feel safe when taking chances and trying new things. And again, I mentioned this earlier, that doesn't mean just letting your team run wild and do whatever they want to do, but give them boundaries around, I'm okay if you do up to this amount, spend up to this amount experimenting in this field, or take this amount of time experimenting with this concept. So give them that structure so that they feel safe and so that they know their boundaries, right? Kind of like my kids, if I don't tell them where the line is, then they'll cross it and then it's a problem. So, and then the last thing that I wanted to leave you with was redefining how we think of innovation, right? So innovation means creating new things, and we tend to put, again, a lot of pressure on ourselves that this has to be the next big thing, when I don't really think that that has to be a goal for a lot of us. Innovation, if you really think about it, can come in many forms. It can mean that we're just doing things differently. It can mean that we're looking at a new target market than what we've traditionally looked at. It can mean that we're thinking about our distribution channels a little bit differently, or our marketing plans differently. So if we have never utilized social media for our marketing, maybe that's a new way of doing things. Or being creative in those spaces as well. So I'm going to read to you again. Hope this is all right. But I found this to be really poignant, and I thought that it would be helpful. So in The Myths of Innovation, Scott Berkun says that he has a simple plan for people that want to start innovating. So number one was pick a project and start doing something. It doesn't matter what it is. You will need many experiences trying something out and experimenting before you get good at even experimenting, right? So pick one thing, set your boundaries for what you're willing to be okay with in terms of time, money, etc., and just start. Number two, forget innovation. Focus on being good. I found that to be a really strong point to make, right? Most products out in the world are not very good. You rarely need a breakthrough to improve things, beat the competition, or help people suffering from a problem. If you carefully study the problem you're trying to solve, you will discover many clear ways to make it better. That's the best place to start. If you solve a problem for customers that makes them happy and earns you money, do you really think they will care whether it's innovative? They just want their problem solved. So he goes on a little bit, but I think you get the gist of that point. And number three, if you work with others, you need leadership and trust. So we've talked about this. Make sure that your leaders are also cultivating that environment and that they're giving people a sense of trust in both directions. I trust my leader, and my leader trusts me, and therefore I'm going to do my best. If you work with others and things aren't going well, make the team smaller. There's a reason many inventions happen in small companies. When there are too many people involved, it becomes hard to really focus on or make a decision around good ideas as they come up. So focus on making your teams smaller. Again, some of this stuff is stuff that you can go back and just do with your teams right away. It doesn't have to be under the title of innovation, right? Think about maybe a project that's suffering in your organization that isn't really going well. Decisions aren't being made fast enough, or it's running a little bit too slow, it's lagging behind. Maybe one of the things to do is to cut the team, make it smaller. Make some of the other team members go work on something else. And then be happy about interesting mistakes. If you're doing something new, it can't go well the first, second, or possibly 50th time. This is okay. Your mindset has to be, am I learning anything from what I just did? So I'm actually trying to focus a lot with companies on valuing the outcome of learning versus just revenue goals or even product growth goals or usage goals or etc. But one of the things that I go into with my contracts is, one of the things that we're going to come out of this is we're going to experiment with a few things and we're going to learn from them, and we'll report our learnings. And making that, helping your managers to see that reporting on learnings is just as important as reporting on project status, right? So instead of just sending you a weekly status report of where projects are, start asking them to include, hey, what did the team learn this sprint or with this project or over the last month? And that can be things like, what did they learn about how to work with each other? What did they learn about the customer? What did they learn about what worked well when we did a release? So I think that we're at the end of our time, but we for my talk portion of this, but we do have some time for Q&A if anybody has questions. Yes?
So just a thought there's other TED Talks on innovation as well, and they talk about
Yes.
passion.
Yes.
If someone has passion, there's a really good one on Orville and Wilbur, right, versus some guys, Stanley or Langley, something like that, and why they discovered flight, and it gets into the passion.
Yeah.
Then I also took an innovation class where they talked about, usually you get the 360-degree view, you get a Java developer, you get a tester, you get an admin, you get a
Right.
manager, whatever. But they went more into personality types. So some people have passion for ideas. They just nonstop ideas, good, bad ideas,
Yes.
whatever. Others have good, the big picture, how does it fit in? Others have ideas on how to implement or
Right.
develop an idea step. And they recommend find out these different personality types. You get those people in a room, and they can really implement. And it really hit home when they broke their group into two groups where they had the people who were the ideas,
Idea
creative,
generators.
that type,
Yeah.
and the developer and implementer into another group. One came up with great ideas but didn't know how to implement or do prototypes of it.
Yeah.
The other group, they could develop. They came up with, they could not come up with an idea to save their life, but once they heard an idea, then they could develop it and nurture it through. And so
Right.
it changed it for me because I've got developers who, they fit into each of those categories. So I throw them into a room, and all of a sudden, some people just have passion for throwing out ideas, and I want to foster that. But other people are just like, oh, this is killing me.
Just
and
tell
I
me what
just-
to do.
I don't have any ideas. That's not me. I don't
Yeah.
have this passion. But they do have passion for taking that idea and looking at the big picture. And so the recommendation there was find out these personality types, what they're passionate about, put
Right.
them together, and then those type of teams become very innovative.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. So part of the kind of diversity of background and that we talked about includes too, like you said, what is their personality or what kind of a skill set do they have? Is it execution or is it ideas?
Yes.
In addition to their background when it comes to skill set or experience. So great point. Yes, I'll go around.
We've got a very small team, and like I say, we manage everything from the servers to the help desk. We travel out to the sites and we'll train the users to use our software.
Mhm.
And I've found that getting out of the office and there with the users, watching them experience the
It's the
pain of
best
using our
thing.
software, right? There's a lot of innovation that comes from there.
Yes.
Now, I don't know how practical that is for most business applications. Have you found that practical everywhere? Or?
Yeah, so that's, I actually debated whether to talk about that point because I'm very passionate about it. I feel like I've worked with development teams that if you tell them a customer is complaining about this thing not working well for these reasons, they might fix it for you, might not be the best solution. But if you have the customer come face to face with them and explain the problem, they're immediately passionate about, oh, my solution or my code that I wrote didn't work for this person, and I need to help them now. So it becomes a very personal thing, and really going and listening. I have teams now involve some of the development team in the early phases of customer research. Because as you're going out and asking questions and what's working for you and what's your current workflow and how do you do things today and what are your pain points, that starts them thinking early on in terms of the customer and their pain and their needs versus, again, starting with the solution. So starting with digging into the problem and seeing that face-to-face, getting, as you have all probably heard, getting out of the building is such a great thing. And I don't think that it's as restrictive as we tend to think. I think you can make environments or make opportunities for that to happen. Yes?
So not all ideas are created equal.
No.
And how do you let people know that some ideas are just not going to go without squashing their desire to innovate? How do you keep it light but realize that
Yeah.
90% of the ideas we're going to reject?
Yeah. So that's where, again, culture matters, right? And so if you have a culture of, it's all right, we're all going to come up with ideas and contribute them, and then maybe you have a voting system in place, right? Maybe you have kind of there's an idea of an innovation scorecard that you can also look up in terms of what are the things that I need to measure or need to think about as the outcomes that I want to come out of this innovation.
Sorry, right along with that, I heard a phrase called commander's intent. Have you ever heard that?
Commander's intent.
If the person is sufficiently educated on what the outcomes are supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
you can let them go. And
They'll
get
basically
there.
fulfill that.
They'll get there.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's about making sure that people know the boundaries around what are your goals, what are the outcomes that you're looking for, and then having those healthy debates about, well, here's why I think that your idea won't really get us there, or this doesn't, fulfill these things, these parts of my criteria, but also just allowing people to experimentation doesn't necessarily mean that I go in and jump in and start writing code, right? It could mean that I go and I do some tests, some validation tests, and that's the best place to start, right? Is you don't want to jump into development before actually validating your business model or your idea from a business perspective. And so encouraging people to start stepping back from jumping into development and starting with the business validation step, those might be really strong signals to them that, okay, I'm going to let you go, take 3, 4, 5 days and go and come back to me with the results of your experiment. Were you able to validate this? Was your work with customers face-to-face, did it give us sufficient feedback and like a strong signal that this is actually going to work, your idea is actually going to work? All right.
I was going to comment
Yeah.
also. I think so much that also depends on how you deliver that feedback.
Right.
You talk about passion. Let's not forget that passion is an emotion.
Right.
And so often, the reason why like a lot of the material that you've shared with us resonates so much is because we feel like we're just going to turn on this innovation switch because it's best practice.
Exactly.
And we are totally not paying any attention to the affective side of how we're interacting with people.
Mm-hmm.
The people that are so passionate and they're innovating in these small organizations, the reason why they don't do so well when they get acquired is because the emotion of passion they're feeling is like inherently incompatible with the emotion of bureaucracy.
And process.
And the process, right? And so you can't turn a blind eye to the emotional intelligence side of things and recognizing that that person does have other good ideas. Of course, if you're always going to reject the ideas of a single person, of course that person is going to feel belittled. But is it really the case that this person never contributes a good idea? There got to be some good things. And if they really are never contributing good ideas, why are they in your organization?
Yeah.
They need to be working somewhere else.
Great. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that worked out for us in terms of innovation is actually even the innovation teams are self-organized.
Yes.
So there is this notion of creating, hey, I have this idea, I need these people to implement the idea. It's using your common communication channels,
Right.
your common intranet and places where you have this collaboration where you pose your idea and have the people to help you implement the idea and show the business results to the executives. And that seemed to work really well.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned also the emotional side of things, but there's structure as well, right? So we tend to, in organizations, sometimes we're not sure how to come to a happy medium. So we either over-process everything and make everything very, structured, or we go the opposite way and we're like, just go innovate. And then when things don't work, we come down hard on our employees. That didn't work or you failed at that. And so one thing, for example, that I was reading today about how Twitter, did you guys hear about the heart instead of the star on Twitter? So now on Twitter, when you like a post, they've just changed it yesterday to be a heart instead of it used to be a star. And, that put a lot of question marks in my head. Like, why is that even important? And I read an article that my friend David Bland wrote about Twitter had this great concept of, within your teams, if you have an experiment that you want to run that impacts 1% or less of our target customer base, then you don't even have to ask for permission, right? Just go out, put it out there in the wild, because the best way to test ideas is to put them out there in front of actual people, right? Whether it's in the form of a prototype or in the form of, just releasing something and seeing how it does. So their rule was, as long as it affects 1% or less of our target customers, of our customer base, then it's okay, go ahead. However, there wasn't a lot of structure around aligning what those experiments were with strategy. So that's where, we can learn from those mistakes and be a little bit smarter. Make sure that every experiment has very clear boundaries. What is it that we're trying to experiment with? What is it that we're trying to learn? How long are we running the experiment? Which one of our business goals does this align with? Or do we think, or we're making an assumption that it aligns with? And then that way you kind of can say before somebody decides to run the experiment, they have a framework for understanding whether it fits in with those business goals or not.
So I think one thing that, and you didn't touch on this, but one thing is what kinds of innovations are you trying to allow in your organization? So like Christensen talks about, there are 3 basic kinds of innovations. There's sustaining innovations, which is really what we're involved with. If we have a business and we're running a business and we're
Right.
trying to provide value to our customer, we're doing sustaining innovation. There's efficiency innovations, and then there's disruptive. so doing a disruptive innovation is a lot different, allowing for disruptive innovation to happen is a lot different than promoting sustaining or efficiency innovations, right? I think most of us would be like, yeah, I want more of, doing business is pretty much sustaining and efficiency, right? So we're gonna be, so if there's a way to increase that, the rate of those, right? But the model for doing disruptive or incubating disruptive innovations in an organization, that's a lot different because most organizations, once you have a product, it's geared around how to make that, right? It's called the core engine. It's like how to make that the most efficient, how to deliver that the most efficient, and like we've been saying, disruptive does not fit in that model. So you have to go outside that somehow.
Yeah, and so so there were two options at one point with one situation that I saw for a company where they wanted to have more innovation, and they created this innovation lab, but they were still under the same management structures, etc. So it really didn't work for them. And one thing that we thought about.
The question I have is, when they say an innovation lab, were they trying to incubate disruptive innovation?
Yes, disruptive innovation. So then one of the things that we kind of figured out after going through that experience was it would have probably worked better if that group was kind of by themselves, not necessarily within the rest of the organization. They were, almost their own entity, right? And they're operating, they have their own kind of way of management and structure of doing things, so that both the people from the main organization don't feel like, oh, those are the ones that come up with ideas, it's not my place to come up with ideas, but also the innovation group doesn't have to worry about the same types of structure and policies as the bigger groups.
So what I mean by a different, people in here that are interested in you should read the book Other Side of Innovation. It's called The Other Side of Innovation, which is, once you come up with an idea or somebody within the organization has a disruptive innovation idea and the business thinks that, how do you actually operate that so
Yes.
that it doesn't completely separate, but they can actually run under a different structure?
Right.
Because the key at some point is that you actually have to integrate that back in.
Right. So you're right. So it is about making sure that at a management level too, they're okay running that group separately or differently than the rest of the organization. So great point. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Hopefully you get to go home soon.